The snow had already begun to fall across the wide Wyoming valley when Thomas Hale rode slowly back toward his ranch. The wind carried thin, white flakes across the frozen fields, and the old wooden fences creaked under the cold. For the first time in his 42 years, Thomas felt something close to hope again, and it had nothing to do with the weather. Inside the pocket of his heavy coat sat a letter he had read at least 10 times during the past 2 weeks. The mail-order agency from San Francisco had finally replied. After years of living alone on the dying ranch, he had done something he never imagined he would do. He had asked for a wife. Not because he believed in romance anymore. That part of his life had ended when his father died, and the ranch slowly began collapsing under debt. He needed help, real help. The cattle were getting thinner each year. The irrigation ditch had nearly dried, and several fields refused to grow anything but dust. The ranch that once fed 3 families now barely kept 1 man alive. The letter in his pocket said the woman would arrive before Christmas. She was from China. The agency described her as quiet, hardworking, and eager to start a new life in America. Thomas didn't know what to expect. He had never even met anyone from China before. But if she was willing to work and share the burden of the ranch, he would treat her with respect. That was enough for him. As he reached the wooden gate leading into the ranch yard, he noticed smoke rising from the cabin chimney. That surprised him. He had left no fire burning that morning. Then he remembered. Today was the day the stagecoach arrived from town. His heart thumped once in his chest. He dismounted quickly and tied his horse to the fence before walking toward the cabin door. When he pushed it open, warm air greeted him. A small figure stood near the fireplace adjusting a kettle. She turned slowly when she heard the door. Her dark hair was tied neatly behind her head, and she wore a simple wool coat far too thin for the Wyoming winter. She looked younger than he expected, maybe 25. Her eyes studied him carefully, but there was calmness in them. "Mr. Thomas Hale?" she asked softly. Her English carried a gentle accent, but the words were clear. He nodded once. "That's me." She bowed her head slightly. "My name is Lin Mei." Thomas removed his hat awkwardly and stepped inside. He had imagined this moment many times, but none of those ideas helped him now. "You made it through the storm?" he asked. She nodded. "The driver stopped me at the gate. I walked the rest." Thomas frowned slightly. That walk was nearly half a mile in deep snow. "You should have waited for me." She gave a small smile. "I am stronger than I look." Thomas set his hat on the table. He noticed something else then. The firewood beside the fireplace had been stacked neatly, the kettle already boiled, and the kitchen table had been cleaned better than he had managed in months. Lin Mei followed his gaze. "I hope it was all right that I tidied the room while waiting." Thomas cleared his throat. "No, that's fine." For a moment, the 2 strangers simply stood in the quiet cabin. The situation felt unusual but not uncomfortable. Lin Mei finally spoke again. "Your ranch is beautiful." Thomas almost laughed. He stepped closer to the window and looked out at the frozen land. "Beautiful isn't the word I'd use these days." She walked beside him and studied the land silently. The wide pasture stretched toward the hills, but most of the grass had died months ago. "Your soil is sick," she said gently. Thomas raised an eyebrow. "You can tell that just by looking?" She nodded. "In my village, my family farmed rice terraces. We studied the earth closely." Thomas shrugged. "Well, this earth stopped listening to me years ago." She looked toward the irrigation ditch running through the far side of the field. "Your water flow is wrong too." Thomas turned to face her now. "Wrong?" Lin Mei walked to the table and grabbed a small stick. She knelt on the wooden floor and drew a rough map of the ranch in the dust near the door. "Your ditch enters from the north," she explained, "but the slope of your land runs west." Thomas watched her carefully. "So?" She moved the stick again, drawing lines in the dust. "Water is lazy. It chooses the easiest path, but you force it uphill here." Thomas stared at the drawing. Then realization slowly crept across his face. He had fought that irrigation ditch for nearly 5 years. The water always drained unevenly, leaving half the pasture dry. Lin Mei finished her drawing and stood up. "If you redirect the ditch here," she said, pointing to a new line, "the water will spread naturally across the field." Thomas crossed his arms. "You're telling me one small ditch will fix the ranch?" She shook her head calmly. "No, but it will save the grass, and grass saves the cattle." Thomas looked out the window again. The wind pushed snow across the empty pasture. For years he had tried everything: new tools, new seeds, new fences, nothing look at near. She said, "There is maiden." Thomas looked at the drawing. The first up in this small, quiet woman had walked into his cabin and within 10 minutes pointed out something he had never even considered. "You really think it will work?" he asked. She met his eyes with quiet confidence. "Yes." Thomas stepped away from the window and grabbed his coat. "Then let's try it before the ground freezes harder." Lin Mei blinked in surprise. "Now?" He nodded. No better time. Within minutes they were outside in the falling snow, digging through frozen soil to redirect the old irrigation ditch. The wind bit at their hands, but neither of them stopped. After nearly an hour, the new channel was finally carved into the earth. Thomas stood back, breathing heavily. "If you're wrong, we just wasted the last daylight." Lin Mei simply pointed toward the ditch. A thin line of water slowly began sliding down the new path. The current curved exactly where she predicted and spread across the lower pasture instead of draining uselessly away. Thomas watched in stunned silence. The water continued flowing naturally across the frozen ground, heading directly toward the driest fields. He looked at Lin Mei in disbelief. "How did you know?" She brushed snow from her sleeves. "The land speaks if you listen carefully." Thomas stared across the pasture, where the water now moved exactly where it had refused to go for years. And suddenly he realized something unexpected. He had ordered a wife for Christmas, but standing beside him in the snow was someone far more valuable to the future of the ranch. And that realization was only the beginning. Thomas stood in the falling snow, staring at the thin stream of water as it spread across the frozen pasture exactly the way Lin Mei had predicted. For years he had struggled with that stubborn ditch, digging deeper, building wooden barriers, even hiring a man from town to help redirect the flow. Nothing had worked. But tonight, a quiet woman who had arrived only hours earlier had fixed the problem with a simple line drawn in the dirt. He let out a slow breath that turned into fog in the cold air. "Well," he muttered, almost laughing to himself, "that's the first good thing that's happened on this ranch in a long time." Lin Mei watched the water quietly for another moment before turning toward the cabin. "You should rest," she said gently. "The wind is getting colder." Inside the cabin, the fire burned stronger now. The warm glow filled the small room, while the storm outside continued to build. Thomas hung his coat near the door and sat down heavily at the table. Lin Mei poured hot tea into 2 cups and placed one in front of him. "You knew farming before?" he asked. She nodded slowly. "My father taught me everything about soil and water. Our village depended on it." Thomas took a long sip of the tea. He studied her carefully. "Then why leave?" Lin Mei's eyes lowered slightly. "Because our land was taken after my father died." Her voice remained calm, but there was quiet pain beneath it. "I had no place there anymore." Thomas understood that feeling too well. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the fire. "This ranch was my father's," he said. "After he passed, the land slowly began dying. I thought maybe it was just my bad luck." Lin Mei shook her head softly. "Land does not die because of luck. It dies because no one shows it the right path." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "You talk about land like it's alive." "It is," she replied simply. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Thomas chuckled quietly. You know, I expected a wife to help cook and keep the cabin from falling apart. Lin Mei gave a small smile. I can do those things too. Thomas laughed again for the first time in weeks. Seems like you brought a lot more than that. Over the next few days, the storm slowly faded and the sky cleared. But the ranch began changing in ways Thomas had not expected. Lin Mei walked the fields every morning, studying the soil. She showed him patches where the ground had been overworked and needed rest. She explained how mixing ash from the fireplace into certain sections could bring nutrients back to the earth. She even showed him how planting different grasses between seasons could protect the soil during harsh winters. Thomas listened carefully to everything. At first, he had doubted her ideas. But the irrigation ditch had already proven she understood the land better than he did. One afternoon, they stood beside the cattle pen, watching the animals graze on the thin winter grass. They are too thin, Lin Mei observed. Thomas sighed. Feed has been scarce for 2 years. She thought quietly for a moment. In my village, we stored winter grain differently. She walked toward the barn and began examining the storage area. Within an hour, she had reorganized the remaining feed into separate piles and mixed certain grains with dried plants Thomas had considered useless. Try this, she said, handing a small bucket to him. Thomas poured the mixture into the trough. The cattle approached cautiously and began eating. And for the first time in weeks, the animals finished every bit of food without leaving anything behind. Thomas crossed his arms thoughtfully. You're full of surprises. Lin Mei simply smiled. Winter passed slowly, but the ranch began improving little by little. The redirected irrigation ditch spread water across the fields when the snow melted. New grass started appearing in places Thomas had given up on years ago. The cattle grew stronger, and the barn slowly filled again with healthier animals. One evening, as spring sunlight stretched across the valley, Thomas stood near the fence watching the pasture. Lin Mei joined him quietly. The land is waking up, she said. Thomas nodded slowly. Feels like the ranch is breathing again. He looked at her thoughtfully. I spent 5 years trying to save this place alone. Lin Mei remained silent. He continued. Turns out I just needed someone who understood the land better than I did. She turned toward him. And someone who was willing to listen. Thomas smiled faintly. Then he looked out across the ranch that no longer seemed like a dying piece of land, but a place with a future again. You know, he said, when I wrote that letter asking for a wife, I was mostly hoping for help keeping the house together. Lin Mei raised an eyebrow playfully. And what did you receive instead? Thomas looked across the fields where water now flowed smoothly through the pasture and cattle grazed on new grass. He shook his head with a quiet laugh. The person who saved the entire ranch. Lin Mei looked across the valley too. The warm spring wind moved gently through the grass, and the wooden fences stood stronger than they had in years. Sometimes the greatest gift someone expects is not the one that truly arrives. And sometimes the person meant to share your life ends up saving far more than just your lonely home.